Consciousness is both the most familiar thing to all of us and one of the most mysterious. What could be more familiar to you than your own stream of consciousness? And yet, how on earth could it fit inside your brain? How on earth could what goes on in your brain actually account for what goes on? What we see here is the cartoonist's wonderful convention, the thought balloon or thought bubble. And I think everybody understands immediately what's going on here. What appears in the balloon is the stream of consciousness, as it were, of the person that you see, from whom it is emanating. My favorite example of a thought balloon is this brilliant one from Saul Steinberg. This was a New Yorker cover many years ago. And what we see is that the gentleman over here on the left is looking at a painting in a museum, and he's identifying it as a painting by Georges Braque. And the word Braque reminds him of the word Baroque, which reminds him of the word barrack, and then bark, and then poodle. And then we're off to the races, and we get his stream of consciousness unfolding with all of its associations. And it's not just words, there's colors and shapes. Even the genius of Steinberg wasn't able to represent recalled odors, aromas, and music, but we can imagine them being in there too. Now, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is, vivid and brilliant as this representation of this man's consciousness is, it's metaphorical. This is a large, systematic metaphor for what's going on in his head. So the problem of consciousness, I would say, is if that's the metaphorical truth about what's going on in the man's head, what's the literal truth that makes the metaphor so good? What's actually happening between his ears that makes this such a brilliant metaphorical description of what's going on in the world? Well, you might say, what's the problem? Why is there any problem at all? Well, you'll notice that Steinberg has represented the man as a sort of wonderful pointillist collection of dots. And that's brilliant because it reminds us that what we are, what you are, what I am, is a huge collection of cells. About 100 trillion at most recent count. 100 trillion cells. That's what you are. Not a single one of those is conscious. Not a single one of those knows who Georges Braque is. Not a single one of those knows what Kilimanjaro is. How can a collection of mindless, unconscious little robotic cells work together to create human consciousness as revealed in that beautiful metaphor? That's the problem of consciousness, and it's really quite severely puzzling. To see why, let's just take a few simple steps. Now, this is a vivid diagram from a textbook on vision by Frisbee of some years ago. And what you can see here is just a little account of what happens so that you can become conscious of this woman standing in front of you. The light bounces off the woman and is focused by the lens, and these are the eyeballs, and an image is formed on the retina, and if you look in there with the right tools, you can see the image. It's a real image. It's upside down, of course. And then that image of stimulation gets transmitted through the optic nerve and up to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and there's the optic chiasma where you get the crossover. And a fraction of a second later, on occipital cortex, right back here at the back of your brain, there is an actual pattern of stimulation which looks, if you could see it, it's not visually visible, of course, but the pattern actually has the shape of the woman. Of course, it's upside down, it's split, it's distorted. You see that the artist has drawn the lips as red. Of course, there's nothing red happening there, but there is stimulation happening in that area of the brain which has the shape of a pair of lips, in fact. Well, but that's clearly not where the consciousness happens. Well, what happens next? Then what happens? Well, cortical processing. Here we see the cortex. That was the part you were just looking at, in fact. And here is, in fact, more particularly the area you were looking at, V1, the first visual area. And you'll see that there are other areas, V2, V3, V7, MT, V8, and so forth. And these are different visual areas in the brain which specialize to some degree. Some specialize in motion, some in location, some in shape, some in color. And they're all doing different parts of the job. But then what happens? Then what happens indeed? Well, then the magic of consciousness happens. Well, what on earth does that mean? This clearly isn't where we stop. We have to come to grips with what happens next. Now, I'm a philosopher, and I got to tell a little joke about philosophers. Okay? How does a philosopher explain a magic trick? So here's how a philosopher explains how many of you have seen The Magician Saw the Lady in Half? All right, good. So here's how the philosopher explains that. Well, you see, the magician doesn't saw the lady in half. He just makes it seem as if he saws her in half. You say, well, yeah, how does he do that? Oh, well, that's not my department. I'm sorry. It's technicalities, that's somebody else's job. So that's how philosophers explain a magic trick. At least that's how many philosophers would explain a magic trick. But not all. Here's a philosopher, Lee Siegel, who's also himself an expert magician, and he's written a wonderful book about street magic in India. He's an expert in Indian religions and philosophy. He's at the University of Hawaii. And in this book, he lives with the street magicians. That's a caste in India. And you learn a lot about how magic arose out of Indian street magic. It's a lovely book. And in it, there's a passage which has become a sort of talisman for me, a passage that I love to quote. He says, I'm writing a book on magic, I explain, and I'm asked, real magic? By real magic, people mean miracles, thaumaturgical acts, supernatural powers. No, I answer, conjuring tricks, not real magic. In other words, real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that's not real, while the magic that's real, that can actually be done, is not real magic. I think, bingo, this is the story of my life. Because the same thing is true of consciousness for many people. Real consciousness, in the eyes of some people, isn't something you could possibly explain. There are even scientists who think, almost by definition, consciousness defies explanation. It is beyond human explanation. If you've explained anything, what you haven't explained is consciousness. Because I think consciousness is real magic. Well, now, it's this problem that I want to face today and give you some help in thinking about how we might address and circumvent this problem. So now I'm going to launch into the world of magic, and I'm going to tell you about the Indian rope trick. Now, I learned all this from Lee Siegel and a few other books that I've read on the subject. Many of you probably think you know what the Indian rope trick is. The magician throws a rope into the air where it hangs somehow suspended. And in fact, here is a very low quality newspaper article about a magician throwing a rope into the air, and it hangs suspended, and his assistant climbs the rope. So far, so good. There's lots of magicians around the world who do one version or another of this. But that is not the Indian rope trick. That's just the beginning of the Indian rope trick. What's the Indian rope trick? Well, a young assistant climbs the rope and disappears into thin air. Disappears into thin air. But then is heard to taunt the magician, who takes a huge knife in his teeth and climbs the rope himself, disappearing in turn. A fight is heard to ensue, screams. You can't see any of this. Little arms and legs, bloody, a severed head, a torso, fall out of the sky and land at the foot of the rope. And then the magician appears out of nowhere, climbing down the rope with tears in his eyes and the bloody knife in his teeth. And he takes all the body parts and puts them in his basket. And with tears in his eyes, he begs the audience to pray for the soul of his little boy. Whereupon he opens up the basket and the boy jumps out whole. All is well. Now, hands up those of you who've seen the trick performed. Ah, yes, not a one of you. But what a trick that would be if it could be done. In fact, although you probably share my view that nobody has ever done the Indian rope trick and nobody ever could, millions of people believe that the trick has been performed. For over 100 years, there have been urban legends, strong convictions held by people all over India and the rest of the world that the Indian rope trick has been performed. And you know how it goes. Well, I didn't see it myself, but I have an uncle who lives in Lahore, and it was his next-door neighbor who saw the trick performed in Bombay, something like that. And you might think, well, now, doesn't that show in a certain sense that the Indian rope trick has been performed? Because after all, what is a magic trick? It's getting people to believe that you've done this amazing thing. You've got somebody to believe you sawed a lady in half when you didn't. Well, now that you know what the Indian rope trick is, I'm going to tell you how to do it. All right? So here's a philosopher who's going to explain the Indian rope trick. How to do the Indian rope trick. Are you ready? And here's method one. First, gather an audience and claim that you're going to perform the Indian rope trick. This first step is actually very important, as you will see. Second, well, this is a step I'm not so clear about. It's not my department. Third, the audience, many of them anyway, exit claiming to have seen the Indian rope trick. Okay? You're probably not satisfied with that explanation. So I'm going to give you another one. One, gather an audience and claim that you're going to perform the Indian rope trick. It's a very important first step. Two, drug them all or hypnotize them. Three, plant the post-it notic suggestion that you've done the trick, complete with lots of details of what it looked like, and let them wake up. Now, this is, in fact, the method that has been surmised by many people, including many magicians, who have tried to explain how so many people in India can be so sure the Indian rope trick has been done. By the way, in the wake of its first wave of publicity, a large reward was offered to anybody who could perform the trick. I mean, it would have been a fortune. In his time, I think £500 sterling, something like this. Nobody has ever claimed the reward. There have been several such rewards offered. But still, there are many people who believe the trick has been performed. Well, you probably don't like this method. I'll give you another method. Alternative method number three. Claim that you're going to do the Indian rope trick. Bribe some newspaper reporters to report in the next day's paper that they witnessed you performing the Indian rope trick. Creates a nice paper trail. Seems to be evidence. I'm sure you don't like it. I'm going to give you one more method, alternative method number four. You notice they all begin the same way. Claim that you're going to do the Indian rope trick. Hire computer graphics experts to create an ultra-realistic videotape of the feat, good enough to fool the experts at CNN, and then send it to CNN as a so-called live feed from the place you claim to be doing the trick. And I bet you don't like that one either. Why? Well, I think you probably think it's cheating. Well, but come on. We're talking about stage magic. What's cheating in stage magic? It's okay to use accomplices. It's okay to use wires and mirrors and smoke and distraction. What are the limits on cheating in stage magic? Well, it's an interesting topic, but who cares? It's just show business. When the topic is consciousness, however, people often feel a little bit differently. And much the same issue arises there, as we're going to see. Now I want to turn to consciousness itself and some of the more magical phenomena of consciousness. The first one I want to consider is déjà vu. How many of you have had a déjà vu experience? Just about everybody? Yes. It's quite remarkable, but it's quite normal. You don't have to go seek a psychiatrist because you've had a déjà vu experience. But many people think of déjà vu experiences as a sign of something pretty special, pretty amazing. Perhaps it's a glimpse that time is cyclical. We go round and round and relive our lives. Or maybe it's transmigration of the soul. Or maybe it's precognition. These are varyingly plausible or implausible, quite dramatic hypotheses about the nature of déjà vu. We might call these déjà vu as magic hypotheses. And now I want to suggest to you a much simpler explanation, which will probably disappoint you. It's actually based on a passage by the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, and I don't know for sure what he meant, but it doesn't matter because I'm not using his account, I'm just using the inspiration of it. And this is what Janet said. He said that déjà vu results from an interruption of a perceptual process so that it splits into a past as well as another current experience. Now here's a little model of just such a phenomenon, okay? So, very simplified. Of course, here's the eye, and we imagine that the signal from the eye, in the optic nerve and later parts of the brain, just suppose that it was split into two channels, channel A and channel B, and suppose that they were completely redundant. They're exactly the same. Channel A and channel B are just, channel B is just a duplicate of what's in channel A. And then suppose that they arrive at a part of the brain that we're going to call the familiarity detector. Well, in fact, some people, Jeffrey Gray and his colleagues, have hypothesized that this is a role that the hippocampus plays, but that says maybe we simply want there to be a place in the brain which has the following properties. As new material comes in, it checks the material for novelty or familiarity. And if it's novel, it lets it through, and if it's familiar, it says, been there, done that. It marks it as familiar. It sends a signal. So now, all we have to suppose, this is the Janet-inspired hypothesis, suppose that the signal in channel B got retarded in its passage from the eye to the detector by a few milliseconds. Just long enough for channel A to go through and set up its signature, its footprint, it's been there, and it goes through a novel event, and just a fraction of a second later, in comes the signal from channel B, and the system says, hey, I've seen it before. Sure enough, 10 milliseconds before you saw it. But that's enough to send the I've seen it before signal on up into the system, and how that then elaborates, well, that's anybody's guess. It might depend very much on what else the person believes. Somebody who's had lots of déjà vu experiences may just say, oh, there goes that déjà vu experience again. Other people may get really tripping out on how, wow, cyclical time, been there before, kismet, and so forth. Now, so there's a somewhat disappointing, mechanical, if you like, hypothesis that it could explain déjà vu. But if that could explain déjà vu, here's a simpler hypothesis that will also explain déjà vu. We don't need channel A and channel B. Channel A is all we need. All we have to suppose is that the familiarity detector, on occasion, for who knows what reason, is spontaneously triggered. It just does a false positive. It just, suddenly it sends the I've seen it before signal spuriously up the line. And the rest, of course, is going to unfold just as it did in the first case. Now, here's the amazing thing. It's a different hypothesis. When you have a déjà vu experience, you can't tell the difference between those two hypotheses. Either one of them could be the truth, and your own conscious experience of déjà vu doesn't give you any clue as to whether either of them might be the truth. This is something for third-person science, empirical investigation, to explore. Notice that in this second case, this is a philosopher telling you this. It's not that you see the thing before, it's that it makes you think you seem to have seen the thing before. That's all that has to happen for déjà vu to happen. Now I want to give you another experience. And now if you concentrate on one of the little black irises in the middle of one of the circles and just look at that, you may find motion around the peripheries. Do any of you see the motion here? Ah, yeah, and if you see it up close, it's very striking. So that there seems to be sort of cogwheels turning against each other and rotating. Now, there's nothing rotating up on the screen. Nothing at all. But the shapes seem to be rotating, right? Nothing is rotating in your brain. If we were to look at the various visual areas where those parts are represented, we wouldn't see any rotation of any image. We would, however, see that regions in which motion detection occurs would be active. No rotation, just signals, like I've seen it before, like something's moving, those signals are being sent on up into the system. It just seems to you that the shapes are rotating. Now another one. I want you now to stare at the white cross and don't move your eyes, and I'm just going to give you a few seconds to stare at the white cross without moving your eyes, and keep staring because I'm going to make the flag go away, and just keep staring straight ahead and you'll see what happens. Are you ready, set, go? Everybody got the American flag? All right, so now there's no red stripes up on the screen. There's no red stripes on your retinal image. There's no red stripes in your visual cortex. And yet, it sure did seem as if there was a red stripe somewhere, didn't there? You were having a flag after image. And you might be willing to say, I've gathered reports from people and they say things like, well, the lowest short red stripe is intersecting the black cross. What? The lowest short red stripe is intersecting the black cross. So I want to know, what are you talking about? What thing are you talking about? Well, you might say something real. Something red. You can refer to it. You can recall it. That red stripe. Where is it? It's not in your brain. No red stripe in your brain. There's nothing red happening in your brain when you see that image. There just seems to be something red happening in your brain. There's that philosopher's explanation again. Well, how does it happen? How does it really happen? Well, I can't tell you. That's not my department, but I can give you some small clues. I want to describe a framework in which we could explain things like this, and I'm going to call it maximally bland computationalism. So we have a brain, and we want to understand that the brain is a computational system consisting of billions, or let's say, who's counting, trillions of registers. Register is a term from computer science, and a register is simply a memory location where you can store a number, really, a value. And it might be 0, or it might be 1, or it might be 375, or it might be 1,000,003. A register is simply an address with a content, and the content is always a number. That is to say, it's always a magnitude of something. So maximally bland computationalism says what the brain is a massively parallel, indeed 3D parallel collection of registers. In this slide, we see maybe 50 or 100 of them, little green registers, but we're really to understand that those stand in for literally trillions of registers in your brain. And each one of them has or can have a value stored in it. And we're going to suppose that the values in the registers can change as a function of the values in other registers. Some of them right nearby, right next door, and some of them perhaps at some distance. If there is an axonal connection from some distance connecting a bunch of registers together, then the value at some distance away may affect the value here. And we just suppose that the values are constantly shifting as a function of the values of other registers, and we explain all this just in terms of physics, just garden variety causal transactions between registers. Now, I call this maximally bland computationalism because it makes no claims about the nature of the architecture. It's not a serial architecture. Well, it's massively parallel. Is it asynchronous or synchronous? Well, presumably it's asynchronous. And the registers can be A neuron, you could consider that a register, or you could consider it as made up of hundreds or thousands of registers. Subcellular activity can be captured in this picture. Neuromodulator activity can be captured in this picture. Thus, if neuromodulators are being diffused through a part of the brain, there's a computational account of that. In fact, it's called diffusive computation. And there are models which look at that. So the fact that we're talking about wet brains with diffusion doesn't mean it's not computational. We can even countenance field effects if they matter. That can all be modeled as more interactions where perhaps distance is really important, but the effects of one register on another can be calculated. Even quantum effects if you think that matters. I don't, but there are those that do. So maximally bland computationalism is a framework which can incorporate just about any serious view I think that anybody holds anywhere in the world today about how the brain works. Just cast into the mold of computationalism. Because the basic underlying idea is that the brain's job is to get the body that it resides in through life by computing the best thing to do next, given the information that it's taking in from the world. That's what brains are for. They're not for cooling the blood. They're not for purifying the blood. They're not a ventilation system. They're a control system. And hence, they're amenable to a computational analysis as long as we're suitably bland about what we mean by computational. Well then, now we can go back to our red stripe and say, what's going on here? How can it seem to you that there's something red when there isn't? Well, some of the computational events that would happen if you were seeing a real external red stripe are happening in you. And these events cause, via this computational route, some of the events that would happen when you have the conviction that you're seeing a red stripe. And that's all. That's all that has to happen. It's like déjà vu. You don't have to show the event twice as long as the conviction that you've seen it before is created, and as long as that conviction has some computational embodiment, you're home. That's what the déjà vu experience consists in. You don't have to saw the lady in half. You just have to make it seem that you do. You don't have to make the event happen twice. You just have to make it seem. You don't have to make the red stripe appear in the brain. It just has to seem to the person whose brain it is that there's been a red stripe. Another example. Now this is a painting by Bellotto, and on the screen here, that's actually about the size that it is. It's a large painting. It's probably a little larger than it actually is, and it hangs in the North Carolina Museum of Art. And I remember vividly the first time I saw it, because I looked at the bridge there. This is a view of Dresden. And Bellotto, by the way, was a student of Canaletto. And if you've ever seen those wonderful Canalettos of Venice, where there's lots of gondolas and gondoliers and ships in the background, 18th century ships. And if you get up real close, you can see, oh, the buckles on the shoes and every bit of the rigging is just represented beautifully. And I love to do that. I love to get right up close to the painting and look at all the detail that the artist has put in. So thinking that this was probably a Canaletto or like it, and noticing that there's on this bridge in the sunlight, there's a whole lot of people moving across the bridge. And I wanted to see them up close. And so I began to get closer and closer and closer and closer. And when I got up close, I actually yelled. I screamed, not a terrific scream, but a real yelp, because what somewhat farther away had seemed wonderfully detailed. As I got closer, there was less detail than I thought there was. It was bizarre. The closer I got, the less detail there was. Now, what was going on here? It's a wonderful trick, but it's one that you're probably familiar with from other. More recently, people have done similar things with computer graphics. But Bellotto was just doing it with his trusty paintbrush. Very clever. The spots, the blobs of paint that he put so artfully on the canvas suggest people with arms and legs and clothes and belt buckles and hats and plumes and carriages and all the rest. And the brain takes the suggestion. Well, what does that mean? What does the brain really do? When the brain takes the suggestion, the brain is forming a set of expectations. That's clear. After all, my expectation was violated so stunningly that I yelled out in surprise as I got closer, because I was expecting, as I moved closer, to see the details really clearly that weren't there. Well, now, how did the brain do this? Well, I don't know. You know, that's not my department. But we can close in on it a little bit. Did the brain, for instance, paint lots of little arms and legs and plumes and hats and buckles and so forth somewhere in one of those cortical areas where there's a sort of an image of the scene, and then look at them? I'm almost certain that's not the case. The brain didn't have to do that. Well, then how did it do it? Well, you know, that's not my department. But I think we can close in again a little bit on that. I think it's a little bit like the post-hypnotic suggestion or the reporter taking a bribe. All the brain has to do is create the judgment in a little part of the brain that is responsible for making judgments of that sort, and then that judgment gets fed up into the system, much like the déjà vu judgment, where it can elaborate other judgments and play a causal role in causing other judgments, and so forth. You don't have to do any painting in the brain for this to happen. Well, now I'm going to give you one more example. How many of you see a cube? A Necker cube. Good, everybody sees the cube. And can you see that it's ambiguous, that there's two different ways that you can see the cube? You can see this as nearest you, or you can see that this is the side that's nearest you. Everybody can see two ways? Okay? How many of you have noticed that, in fact, it is four ways ambiguous? How many of you see the cube as floating in front of a bunch of black circles? Okay? How many of you can see the cube as behind a white curtain with some round holes in it? It's a little bit hard for people to see this. So how many of you still can't see it that way? I'm going to help you. Now, can you see it as behind the screen, behind the piece of Swiss cheese? Now I want you to see it as in front of the discs, the way you probably saw it the first time. And you may notice, you could swear there was a boundary there, there was a line. You might even think that I'm cheating by having two shades of white there. See how it looks sort of whiter than white, and you can just about see that line there. How many of you can sort of feel that effect? Well, you know, it's very interesting, yes. In fact, what we know is that in this case, the relevant parts of the brain actually are forming that line. That the neurons that are responsible for representing this edge and the neurons that are responsible for representing this edge are recruiting their neighbors across the gap and making them active. That's one of the things that we can tell about how this is done. But now, when you see the cube as behind the Swiss cheese, that's actually a different phenomenon. It's operating differently. And I'll give you an example that will make this clear. Notice you have no trouble seeing the cube as a cube. But now, where does the color change happen? Where does the purple turn to green? Where does the blue turn to yellow? And you'll notice that the brain doesn't have to go into that at all. Now you might imagine that behind the scenes in your brain there's a little fight going on. You know, those with the yellow paintbrushes and those with the blue paintbrushes are having a little fight about who gets to do the last bit of the intervening part. But in fact, you don't have to have that in there at all, because that's not how the brain has to do it. Well, I've been using this example for a number of years, and I thought I understood the mechanisms of the brain responsible for it. These are two different phenomena. This is called amodal completion, and the case where it's in front is an example of a modal completion or illusory contour. Two different well-studied phenomena. And then I saw this by Rob Van Leer in Perception, the journal Perception, and I'm going to show you now a little video. Now what you want to do, what I'm going to make happen, is the yellow and the blue vertical bar are going to go left to right, and you're going to see the bar moving here and here, and of course this is opaque. But I want you to look in these opaque regions and see if you see what seems to be the shadow moving in the gray. Any of you see what looks like a sort of shadow? See motion in the gray? I would have bet good money that that effect wouldn't have been there. But there it is. We learned something more by running another clever experiment. So what do we learn from this? We learn not to trust our own conscious, introspective experience for how these things really work. If you want to know how to explain the magic trick, you have to go backstage and see what's really going on. Something less than a cube or a picture of a cube convinces you that you're seeing a cube, in the case of the Necker cube. And you may say, well, but in other words, the brain cheats. And I find that when I say this, some people have the following reaction. They say, not my brain. My brain doesn't cheat. But the point I want to make to you is, you don't know that. You don't know that. You're not entitled to that. This is precisely what you don't know from personal first-hand experience. This is something for science to discover, the extent to which and how and when the brain actually cheats. Now, some of you may be thinking about, wait a minute, this is all very interesting, but there's something fundamentally wrong with it. What I'm saying is that cognitive neuroscience can be seen as, in effect, reverse engineering the magic show, going to the stage magic show and showing you how the tricks are actually done. Going backstage, I just said that. What needs to be explained, I've said, is what the audience thinks happened on stage. And this is, in fact, what I've called heterophenomenology. This is phenomenology of the third-person point of view. You gather lots of evidence about what the audience thinks is happening, and then you have to explain why they think that. And you can do it in your own case, too. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, here's what seems to be wrong with it. What about the audience? And especially, what am I doing talking about the audience? Because one of the main themes of my work ever since 1991 in Consciousness Explained is that there's no such thing as the Cartesian theater. The Cartesian theater is my derisive negative term for the imaginary place in the brain where the inner witness sits, the audience sits and enjoys the show of consciousness. And I've said there is no such place. Now here's a nice spoof painting of the Cartesian theater. And you see the light comes in and exposes the film, which then, this is a wonderful old picture, old-fashioned picture. The film gets developed, then the fan dries the film. That's a nice touch. Then it goes through the camera and is projected on a screen where not one but two homunculi, little people in white coats, look at the screen. Now, this is a terrible, in fact, a preposterous view of consciousness. And what's preposterous about it isn't that it's film as opposed to videotape or something, or that they're wearing white coats and have arms and legs. What's wrong with this is something much more fundamental. What's wrong with this is that If anything remotely like this were true, then we wouldn't have even started to explain consciousness, because we would still have a conscious observer sitting there in the theater looking at the screen. We have to get away from that image. There is, in fact, no place in your brain where it all comes together for consciousness. Now, there might have been. This is an empirical fact. There might have been. It might have been that when neuroscientists finally got around to looking in the brain, they went upstream from the lateral geniculate nucleus to V1 to V2 to V3, and then they went a little farther, and then they found a little place in there where the Cartesian theater was. And in fact, you've seen this in films. If you've seen Men in Black, you've seen the scene where Will Smith opens up the drawer in the morgue, and there's the corpse of the tall, bald man, and Will Smith reaches out and clicks a little button, and the face opens up, and inside there's a little man, a little green man in there, and he's sitting there looking at the screens and pushing the buttons, and he's got the speakers on each side of his ears. That's the Cartesian theater. And it turned out that the great big man was just a sort of puppet being controlled by this little man inside. So it's not logically impossible that there should be a Cartesian theater. It's just empirically the fact that there isn't. Now, in the Men in Black situation, we wouldn't have a theory of consciousness. We'd have a good theory of puppetry. And we'd have to look inside the little green man's head to see what kind of a theory of consciousness we were going to have. The moral of this story is that we're going to have to break up the Cartesian theater into parts that are not themselves conscious. So the moral of the Cartesian theater is that all the work done by the imagined homunculus in the Cartesian theater must be distributed around to various lesser agencies in the brain. And that means agencies that are not themselves conscious. Because if they're really conscious, then we've just recreated the homunculus problem, and we will not have made any progress at all. This can be done. I've given you a few examples of little parts of this. Well, now, this creates a dilemma, though, because a lot of people are very unhappy with this. And I call this the dilemma of the subject. What I've just said is, if you leave the subject, meaning I, ego, moi, the subject of experience, if you leave the subject in your theory, then you've not yet begun your theory of consciousness. You've just postponed the theory. On the other hand, if you don't leave the subject in your theory, then some people say you're evading the main issue. The philosopher David Chalmers has called this the hard problem. If you don't leave the subject in the theory, then you're just evading the hard problem. What are we going to do? Well, I've told you what I think we have to do. We have to agree with the first point here. We have to agree that if you leave the subject in your theory, you have not yet begun. So you have to get rid of the subject. And when you do this, the result has a certain scary, even disgusting feature. It's as if you entered a factory and there's all this humming machinery and there's nobody home. There's no watchman, there's no supervisor, there's no boss. It's all just machinery. And I'm saying that's got to be the case. If your theory does not have that feature, it's got to be wrong. If you still have the watchman there, if you still have the audience there, you haven't begun your theory. And a lot of people really don't like that idea. Let me give you a few examples. Good old Jerry Fodor, my friend and colleague and opponent for many years. You can always count on Jerry to say what is exactly false with great gusto. For instance, if, in short, there's a community of computers living in my head, then there also better be somebody who's in charge, and by God, it had better be me. That is as evocative an expression of Cartesian materialism as I think I've ever seen. Or how about this from Bob Wright? Of course, the problem here is with the claim that consciousness is identical to physical brain states. The more Dennett and others try to explain to me what they mean by this, the more convinced I become that what they really mean is that consciousness doesn't exist. Now, does that sound familiar? I hope so. What Wright is saying is what people say about real magic. Real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that's not real, while the magic that's real that can actually be done is not real magic. What Wright thinks is that if I'm saying that consciousness is a bunch of tricks in the brain, then what I'm really saying is that consciousness doesn't exist. There isn't any real magic. But there's others who hate the idea even more. Here's my favorite of all. Daniel Dennett is the devil. There is no internal witness, no central recognizer of meaning, and no self other than an abstract center of narrative gravity, which is itself nothing but a convenient fiction. For Dennett, it is not a case of an emperor having no clothes. It's rather the clothes have no emperor. Yeah, that's right. Bingo. You got to get rid of the emperor. If you still have the emperor in there, you don't have a theory of consciousness. Now, that's a hard idea for people to get their heads around. But then we knew, didn't we, that if you're going to explain consciousness, the result is going to have to be uncomfortable in some ways. It's going to have to be, as philosophers like to say, counterintuitive. Why? Because if there was an intuitive solution to the problems of consciousness, we would have found it long ago. We've been working on this for several thousand years. Clearly, something that people think is just plain obvious, not worth talking about, is just false. Counterintuitive. I've just given you a few examples of what I think the counterintuitive claims should be that we should make. And if you find them counterintuitive, good. Now, try to swallow them. That's the hard part. I can't prove that my way is right, but I can at least tease your imagination some and give you an example which might at least get you to suspend judgment about the way that I'm going with this. And it is another magic trick. And this is a trick called the tuned deck. Now, there was a time when I could actually do this trick. It's a card trick. I can't do it anymore, so I'm just going to fake it just so you get an idea of what it looks like. Now, I learned about this trick from John Hilliard in his book Card Magic. This is not a book you find in your library. This is one of those privately printed books for magicians only. And Hilliard writes as follows. For many years, Mr. Ralph Hull, the famous card wizard from Crooksville, Ohio, has completely bewildered not only the general public, but also amateur conjurers, card connoisseurs, and professional magicians with a series of card tricks which he is pleased to call the tuned deck. Okay, now I'm going to fake the tuned deck. It goes sort of like this. Boys, I have a new trick. Now this is to his fellow magicians, right? Boys, I have a new trick. It's called the tuned deck. Here's my tuned deck. It is tuned. I listen to the vibrations, buzz, 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 buzz. And by those vibrations, I can tell exactly which card is there because of the different tuning of the vibrations. Here, pick a card, any card. The card is picked, it goes back into the deck. There's some more shenanigans, some more buzz, buzz, and then the card is produced. That's it. Now, Hull did this trick hundreds of times. Nobody ever got it. He would sit with his sleeves rolled up and perform the trick for fellow magicians 20, 30 times. Nobody ever got it. They tried to buy the trick from him. He wouldn't sell it. Magicians do sell tricks. Late in his life, he gave the trick and his account of it to Hilliard, his friend Hilliard, and Hilliard published it in his book. And here's a little bit of what Hull says. He says, for years I've performed this effect and have shown it to magicians and amateurs by the hundred, and to the very best of my knowledge, not one of them ever figured out the secret. The boys have all looked for something too hard. Oh, thank you for saying too hard. Now, I'm going to tell you the secret of the tuned deck. Are you ready? The tuned deck Like many great magic tricks, the trick is over before you think it's even begun. In this case, the trick consists in its entirety in the name of the trick, the tuned deck. Moreover, in one of the words in the title of the trick. Which word? No, not deck. Tuned? No. The. I told you the trick is over before you even think it's begun. Here is what Hull was doing. Remember how it starts? Boys, I have a new trick. It's called the tuned deck. The trick is now over. All the palaver with buzz and vibrations, we know that's not the trick. What does he do? He does a standard card presentation trick that everybody there knows. The cards come back and his fellow magicians think, you know, couldn't he be doing a type A trick? I'm not going to give away any more magic. So they're good magicians. They know how to prevent a type A trick. So they're obstreperous in the right way, and so they prevent him from doing, they're testing their hypothesis that it's a type A trick. He still does the trick. They say, could he be doing a type B trick? We could prevent that by doing, so they do what they could do to prevent a type B trick. He still does the trick. Gee, could it be a type C trick? Maybe. They test that hypothesis, he still does the trick. What's left? Could it be a type D trick? They test that. No matter what hypothesis they test, he always does the trick. They can't prevent him from doing the trick. What's happened is, it was a type A trick. Then when they test that, he does a type B trick. When he tests B, he does a type C trick. When they test that, he goes back and he does a type A trick. He realized he could always do one trick or another, and he just did whichever trick they let him do. And the reason they didn't tumble for it was the word the tuned deck. They were looking, as he said, for something too hard. They were looking for a hard problem, not a bunch of cheap tricks. In fact, all the tricks that they were doing were tricks that were quite familiar and in a certain way disappointing. And he hid all this with an elegant title. Now, I do want to suggest, but I don't claim to prove, that when David Chalmers talks about the hard problem, he is innocently playing a trick on himself and others of exactly this sort. He's giving a name to a problem that doesn't even really exist. The problems of consciousness are how all of the various effects work. And once you've got an account of all those effects, that's what Chalmers calls the easy problems, you're home. You've explained consciousness. Because there isn't any further problem, the hard problem, there just seems to be. So here's, again, what Hull says about the tuned deck. He says, consciousness is both the most familiar thing to all of us and one of the most mysterious. What could be more familiar to you than your own stream of consciousness? And yet, how on earth could it fit inside your brain? How on earth could what goes on in your brain actually account for what goes on? What we see here is the Consciousness is both the most familiar thing to all of us and one of the most mysterious. What could be more familiar to you than your own stream of consciousness? And yet, how on earth could it fit inside your brain? How on earth could what goes on in your brain